Imagine the heavy heat of a summer afternoon, the air thick with the smell of earth and sweat. In the distance, the sound of cotton bolls being plucked fills the fields like a slow, relentless drumbeat. Among the workers is a woman whose belly is round with new life. Her steps are careful but steady. Her back aches, and the child inside her shifts with every movement. In another place and time, she might be resting, cared for by family, waiting for the moment to welcome her baby into the world. But here, rest is a luxury she will never know. She bends to pick up another sack, the weight pressing against her swollen frame. There are no gentle words of encouragement, no promise of time off to recover. The demands of the day do not bend for her. The rules here are unyielding. Every hand must work, no matter the pain, no matter the risk. Her health, her safety, even the life of the child she carries, all of it is secondary to the work expected of her. And when her time finally comes, when the contractions ripple through her body, and her breath shortens with the effort of bringing new life into the world, she is given no clean bed, no skilled hands to guide her. She may deliver her baby in a crude cabin or in the very fields where she labored just hours before. There is no doctor, no medicine, no relief from the agony. She will cradle her newborn for only a short while before duty calls her back to the same back-breaking labor sometimes, within mere days of giving birth. The thought of such a reality is almost unbearable. Yet for countless women in history, it was their daily truth. They endured physical pain, exhaustion, and unimaginable emotional torment, and knowing that the child they had carried and suffered for might soon be taken from them. Their stories were not written in the history books we grew up with. Their names were rarely remembered. But their strength, their courage, and their suffering shaped a world we still live in today. In this video, we will uncover the hidden history of these women, their struggles, their resilience, and the systems that sought to control their bodies and their futures. It is a story that is painful to hear, but one that must be told, because silence only allows injustice to fade into the background. By shining light on their experiences, we honor their memory and confront the truths that history tried to bury. If you believe that history should be told in full, the good, the bad, and the uncomfortable, then stay with us until the end. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps bring these hidden stories to more people, so they are never forgotten again. Your support allows us to continue sharing the voices of those who could not speak for themselves. Together, we can ensure that their stories are heard, their lives remembered, and their humanity recognized. For a brief moment, there is peace. In the dim light of early morning, she holds her newborn close, feeling the small, warm breaths against her skin. The world beyond the cabin walls is still, but she knows it will not stay that way. Every heartbeat, every tiny movement of the child in her arms is precious, because deep down, she understands that time is not hers to keep. The child's soft cries, the gentle way their tiny fingers curl around hers, all of it is a fragile gift that can be taken away without warning. She has seen it happen too many times to others, women who returned from the fields one evening to find an empty cradle, the sound of their grief echoing across the quarters like a wound that never closes. Days turn into weeks, and the infant begins to grow. The mother works from sunrise to sunset, her body still healing but her hands moving without pause, because she knows that any sign of slowing down might draw unwanted attention. At night, she rocks her baby to sleep, singing softly in a language she learned from her own mother, words that speak of protection and love. These songs are not just lullabies, they are acts of resistance, a way to pass on fragments of identity and heritage that no one can fully erase. Yet, there is an unspoken understanding among the women. Once a child is weaned, once they no longer need their mother's milk, they become vulnerable in a new way. It is then that the owners see them not as someone's child, but as an asset, a small body that can be sold, traded, or used to settle debts. There is no consideration for the bond that has formed, no recognition of the months of care and sleepless nights. The decision is made in a room far away, where men speak of prices and markets, not names or futures. When that day comes, it often arrives without warning. A rider may appear with a piece of paper in his hand, the message already sealed in ink. The mother might be told to bring the child to the yard, her mind struggling to process the command even as her feet move forward. In her, the little one clings to her, sensing that something is wrong but unable to understand. She tries to memorize every detail: the curve of their cheek, the way their hair curls at the edge, the sound of their voice, because she knows she will not have another chance. There are no goodbyes that feel complete. Some women try to hide their tears, hoping to protect their child from fear in these final moments together. Others weep openly, their cries mixing with the sound of hooves and wheels as the wagon pulls away. The child may look back, small hands reaching out until the distance swallows them from view. That is when the silence sets in, heavier than any chain, because it is not just the absence of a person, but the tearing away of part of oneself. The loss does not fade quickly. It lingers in the spaces where the child once slept, in the songs that now catch in her throat, because there is no one left to sing them to. The other women in the quarters understand. They offer quiet comfort, a shared nod or a gentle touch on the shoulder, because they too carry memories of faces they will never see again. These shared losses create bonds between them, but they also deepen the constant ache that life in such a place demands they bear. For the children, the journey is no kinder. Many are too young to grasp what is happening, their cries unanswered as they are taken to new plantations where unfamiliar hands will dictate every part of their existence. They will grow up without the warmth of their mother's embrace, learning instead to navigate a world that sees them only in terms of how much labor they can give. Some will forget the faces of the women who gave them life, not because they wish to, but because time and distance will erase the details. Others will hold on to vague images: the sound of a voice, the rhythm of a song, carrying these fragments like a small fire hidden deep inside. This cycle repeats itself across countless lives, an endless pattern that stretches through the years. It is not accidental. It is part of a system designed to keep people separated, to weaken the ties that might inspire hope or rebellion. By breaking the bond between mother and child, those in power sought to control not just bodies, but hearts and minds as well. And yet, despite this cruelty, the bond never fully disappears. The love a mother feels for her child cannot be erased by distance or dictated by the will of another. The stories of these separations were rarely written down, yet they were carried in the memories of those who lived them. When the night was quiet and the stars shone above, some women would speak in hushed tones about the children they had lost. They would share their names, the little habits that made them laugh, the dreams they once held for them. It was a way of keeping them alive in memory, a quiet act of defiance against the forces that had tried to erase them. Even today, when we hear these stories, they remind us of the strength it took to survive such losses. They remind us that behind every statistic, every line in a history book, there were real people whose lives were shaped by love, pain, and resilience. The mother in the field, holding her baby close before the world takes them apart, is not just a figure from the past. She is a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, love endures. And as long as we remember her story, and the stories of countless others like her, the bond between mother and child will never truly be broken. After the wagon wheels disappeared down the dusty road, taking her child to a place she would never see, the mother returned to the rows of work that stretched out endlessly before her. The weight in her chest was heavier than the sack on her back. But in this world, grief was not a reason to stop. The system around her had been built to make sure such losses were not rare accidents. but part of a deliberate design, one that had become even more ruthless after a change in the law reshaped the trade in human lives. In 1808, when the United States officially ended the importation of enslaved people from overseas, many might have thought it was the beginning of the end for this brutal institution. But for the men who profited from it, the ban was not a barrier, it was a challenge, and their answer to it was a new, calculated cruelty. Instead of bringing people across oceans, they turned inward, seeing the women already in their possession not as individuals with their own dreams and dignity, but as the source of a new kind of wealth. The future of their fortunes now depended on how many children could be born into bondage. Each new life immediately counted as property from the moment of birth. These children did not represent joy to the owners, they represented numbers in a ledger, future labor to harvest crops, or valuable goods to sell in distant markets. In this way, the very bodies of enslaved women became the foundation of a business model designed to replace the ships that once sailed from African shores. On some plantations, this shift was visible in the way women's lives were controlled even more tightly. Pairings were arranged not out of any regard for the feelings of the people involved, but with the same cold calculations one might use for breeding livestock. Strength, youth, and health became markers of value in a marketplace that saw human reproduction as an investment. A young woman might be forced into relationships with multiple men chosen by her owner, her consent never sought, her life's path altered by decisions made without her voice. Once she gave birth, the cycle would begin again, with her body pushed to its limits in the relentless drive to produce more. For those who lived through it, the emotional toll was devastating. Many had already endured the trauma of seeing family members sold away, but now even the possibility of keeping a child close was shrinking. The owner's eyes were always on the next generation, not as sons and daughters, but as hands to work the fields or as currency to be exchanged. In some places, entire farms were devoted to nothing but this practice, where the rhythm of life was dictated not by planting and harvest, but by the timing of pregnancies and births. The language of profit cloaked the reality of human suffering, as owners justified their actions as necessary for the continuation of their estates. Those who resisted in whatever ways they could often did so quietly. Some women delayed weaning their children in hopes of keeping them close for a little longer. Others sought out herbal remedies to slow or prevent pregnancies. Knowledge passed in whispers from one generation to the next as a means of reclaiming some measure of control. These acts of resistance were dangerous, for discovery could bring punishment, but they were acts of courage nonetheless. Small flames of defiance in a world that tried to extinguish every spark. The cruelty of this system was not limited to one region or a handful of owners. It was woven into the laws and economic structures of the time. Legislators who debated the morality of importing new captives from abroad did not often challenge the ownership of those already in the country. The 1808 ban became a turning point not because it ended the exploitation of human lives, but because it shifted its focus entirely onto those already trapped within the system. The same legal codes that defined people as property made it possible for children to inherit their mother's condition, ensuring that the cycle of bondage could continue without the need for a single ship to arrive from foreign shores. Within the quarters, the women knew this reality too well. Conversations often drifted to who was expecting, who had recently given birth, and the fates of the children who had been taken away. There was joy in the arrival of a new baby, but it was always shadowed by the knowledge that the child's future was already mapped out by others. The owners might congratulate themselves on the growth of their holdings, while the mothers counted the days until someone might come to claim what was never theirs to take. The years after 1808 saw entire generations born and raised without ever knowing a world beyond the fences of the plantation. For the owners, this was proof of the system's sufficiency. For the women who bore these children, it was a reminder of how their own bodies had been turned into tools for someone else's gain. Still, They found ways to pass down pieces of their identity: songs, stories, and quiet lessons taught by the firelight, planting seeds of resilience in their children's hearts. Even if they could not protect them from the wider system, the practice endured for decades, its human cost hidden beneath the language of trade and law, until the day the entire institution finally fell. But by then, the damage had been done to countless lives, and the legacy of that cruelty would echo through generations. What happened in the years after 1808 was not an unintended consequence of the ban on the international trade. It was an intentional, calculated expansion of control, built on the belief that a person's worth could be measured in how much labor or profit they could produce from birth until death. And in the shadow of that belief, women carried the heaviest burden, bearing children into a world where love was powerless against the demands of ownership, yet still finding ways, however small, to hold on to their humanity. The law was not a shield for these women. It was a chain that bound them tighter. In the eyes of the courts and the men who wrote the rules, they were not human beings with thoughts, dreams, and dignity, but possessions, no different from the fields they worked or the tools they used. Every statute, every clause, every ruling carved into the legal codes of the time reinforced the idea that their value lay not in their humanity, but in what they could produce, how much they could endure, and the profit they could bring. A woman could stand before the law with her heart breaking, her child taken, her body bearing scars from years of labor, and yet in the cold language of ownership, she was not recognized as a victim but as an asset. This legal framework was not hidden or vague. It was explicit, written to protect the financial interests of those who claimed ownership over her. A woman's ability to bear children was a matter of economic calculation, and laws were crafted to ensure that her children would never belong to her. From the moment of birth, those children were legally bound to the same fate as their mother, destined to be sold, traded, or forced into the same exhausting cycle of labor. In this way, the system perpetuated itself across generations, with the law standing guard to ensure it would not be broken. For these women, there was no recourse, no court to plead their case, no rights to claim. Even the most intimate parts of their lives, whom they could marry, whether they could keep their children, when or if they could rest, were dictated by others. A moment of joy, like holding a newborn child, was shadowed by the knowledge that she had no legal power to protect that life from being taken away. This constant fear was not just an emotional burden, it was a weapon, a way to keep people compliant through the crushing weight of hopelessness. Yet despite the laws and the system designed to strip them of their humanity, many women resisted in quiet and powerful ways. Some taught their children songs and stories that carried fragments of their heritage, knowing that culture could be a form of survival. Others formed bonds of solidarity with women around them, sharing food, comfort, and whispered words of encouragement in the stolen moments between work. The law could control their bodies, but it could not fully extinguish the spark of their identity, their will to care for one another, and their determination to hold on to something that was theirs alone. Still, the legal language of the time left no doubt as to where power lay. Contracts could be drawn up to sell a woman alongside her children, or to split them apart without hesitation. Inheritance laws ensured that the children of enslaved mothers would remain in bondage, even if their fathers were free. Court cases upheld the rights of owners over the pleas of mothers, reinforcing the belief that property rights outweighed the bonds of family. In such a world, even hope became a dangerous thing, because to hope was to imagine a future that the law refused to recognize. This systematic denial of personhood was not an accident of history. It was an intentional design, built to protect wealth and maintain control. Every time a law was passed or upheld in favor of those who held power, it sent a clear message. The humanity of these women did not matter in the eyes of the law. They were a means to an end, and the end was profit. Their pain was invisible in the ledgers, their tears unrecorded in the archives. But their labor and their bodies were meticulously accounted for, as if they were nothing more than figures on a balance sheet. Even so, the strength of these women was extraordinary. They learned to navigate a system that was built to crush them, finding ways to protect their children when they could, to resist when the risk was worth taking, and to pass down a legacy of resilience that could survive even in the harshest soil. They carried their stories forward not through written records, but through memory, song, and whispered histories that would outlast the laws meant to erase them. The tragedy is that for centuries, these stories were buried under the weight of official records that spoke only in the language of ownership. It is only when we look beyond the laws and into the lived experiences of these women that we can understand the full depth of their struggle. Their fight was not only against the immediate hardships of labor and loss, but against an entire legal system that defined them as something less than human. In reclaiming their stories today, we are not just remembering the past, we are breaking the silence that those laws tried to enforce, and honoring the humanity they refused to surrender. History often casts its brightest light on the grand achievements of influential figures, the elegant portraits in gilded frames, the marble statues that stand in public squares, and the eloquent speeches that shaped nations. But in the shadows of these celebrated images, there existed another reality, a truth that those same figures either carefully concealed or openly embraced as part of their economic power. Among them were men whose names remain etched in American history. Men like Thomas Jefferson and Pierce Butler. Their political influence, land holdings, and lofty rhetoric about liberty and justice often overshadow a darker side of their legacy. The operation of large farms, where the bodies and futures of enslaved women were treated as instruments of profit. The scale of these farms was staggering, and the quiet efficiency with which they operated was as chilling as it was calculated. After the 1808 ban on importing enslaved people from overseas, the domestic trade became the backbone of the institution. And for men like Jefferson and Butler, the logic was simple. If the law stopped the ships, then the children of enslaved women would become the new supply line. On these vast estates, the labor of women was twofold, not only toiling in the fields or kitchens, but also enduring the relentless expectation to bring more children into the world. Children who were seen not as human beings with futures of their own, but as the next generation of laborers whose existence would increase the wealth and stability of the owner's estate. For Jefferson, a man revered as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, the contradiction was striking. His writings proclaimed that all men were created equal, yet his own plantation depended on a system where equality was not only denied, but the lives of the people he enslaved were meticulously recorded in ledgers alongside livestock and harvests. In private, Jefferson calculated the value of each new birth, noting that the increase of enslaved women was as good as gold. For Pierce Butler, one of the wealthiest men in the early republic and a signer of the U.S. Constitution, the approach was similarly pragmatic and cold. His Sea Island plantations in South Carolina became some of the most productive in the South, built on the labor of hundreds of enslaved people, with the women on his property playing a role in sustaining that labor force across generations. Life on these breeding farms was not marked by the brutal chaos of war or sudden violence. Instead, it was defined by a slow, steady erosion of autonomy and hope. Each year brought its own rhythms. Planting, harvesting, and the quiet tallying of new births. A young girl might grow up working under the watchful eye of an overseer, only to be told that her future was not hers to shape, that her role was to work and to bear children who would, in turn, live and labor on the same soil. The walls of the plantation homes, with their polished wood and imported furnishings, concealed this unspoken machinery of wealth, a system that reduced the most intimate aspects of human life to a line item in an owner's financial records. And yet, within this system, The women themselves were not silent in their hearts. They carried memories of families torn apart, of children sold away, of moments stolen from them. They shared whispered stories in the quarters at night, tales of the world beyond the plantation, of possible freedom, of the dignity they still held within themselves despite everything. These quiet moments of humanity and resilience existed in direct defiance of the system's cold arithmetic. When we look back at figures like Jefferson and Butler, history often wrestles with how to reconcile their public accomplishments with their private realities. The narrative of American liberty was, in part, written by men whose fortunes were secured through the denial of liberty to others. The grandeur of their estates, the influence they wielded in politics, and the legacies they left behind cannot be fully understood without also acknowledging the cost paid by the women whose bodies sustained their wealth. This is the part of history that cannot be left in the margins. It forces us to confront not only the contradictions of the past, but also the ways in which those contradictions shaped the nation that emerged from it. The names of Jefferson and Butler may be celebrated in textbooks, but the names of the women who endured on their lands, the women who worked, bore children, and carried their stories in silence, are often lost. Their absence in the written record is not a reflection of their insignificance, but rather a testament to how thoroughly the system tried to erase their humanity. In telling these stories now, we restore at least a fragment of that humanity. And we remember that history is not only the story of those who stood in the light, but also of those who lived and struggled in the shadows, whose courage was never written on parchment, but lived out in the quiet determination to endure. Mary Reynolds remembered the world she was born into not as a distant shadow, but as a constant ache that never left her bones. She had been a child when she first began to understand that her life, and the lives of those around her, were not their own. She spoke of the endless days under the sun, the unyielding work, and the way women were pushed into pregnancies, not for the joy of raising a family, but for the gain of those who claimed ownership over them. In her voice there was a kind of quiet endurance, but also a sorrow that ran deep, because for every child born into that system, there was a looming chance they would not remain with their mother for long. Harriet Jacobs, too, bore witness to this reality, though her testimony carried with it the sharp edge of personal violation. She told of living under the gaze of a man who viewed her not as a person, but as something to control, someone whose body could be claimed without her consent. She described the strategies she used to resist, the moments she tried to carve out some measure of dignity in a life that allowed her so little control, and the unbearable decisions she made to protect herself and her children. Both women's accounts intertwined into a larger truth about that world, a truth in which pregnancy was not a sacred choice, but an imposed destiny, where the joy of motherhood was tainted by the constant fear of separation. For Mary Reynolds, each child born among her people was a bittersweet miracle. It meant another soul to love, another reason to fight, yet also another life under the threat of being torn away. She spoke of mothers who sang lullabies with voices trembling, who memorized every line of their babies' faces as though storing them for a time when only memory would remain. Harriet Jacobs' narrative went further into the shadows, revealing the harassment, the threats, and the manipulation that sought to strip women of any sense of self. She told how such cruelty was not random but systematic, reinforced by laws and customs that gave these acts the appearance of legitimacy. What makes these testimonies so haunting is the clarity with which they reveal the emotional landscape of that time. These were not abstract injustices. They were daily realities: waking to labor in fields even while carrying a child, returning to work within days of birth, and feeling the constant unease of knowing that at any moment the people you loved most could be taken from you. For Harriet, the fight for survival meant making impossible choices, sometimes even distancing herself from her children to keep them safe from the man who sought to control her. Mary Reynolds, on the other hand, endured the grind of labor while clinging to whatever fragments of family life she could hold on to, watching others around her crumble under the same weight. Through their words, we see how the forced pregnancies, the violations, and the separations were not only attacks on the body, but on the very bonds that make us human. They remind us that beyond the physical hardships, there was an assault on identity, on belonging, on the ability to love freely without fear of loss. Their courage in speaking about these experiences, in refusing to let them be erased, has ensured that we can still hear their voices today, carrying across time with the same urgency and grief. Even now, reading their stories, one can feel the heaviness they carried and the resilience they held on to despite it all. Mary Reynolds and Harriet Jacobs are not simply figures in history. They are witnesses whose words dismantle the illusion that such suffering can ever be justified. Their lives tell us that the wounds left by those years are more than scars on the past, they are lessons, etched deeply, about the cost of denying another person's humanity. And in sharing their truths, they ensure that these stories, however painful, are never forgotten. For many women living under that system, the moment of bringing life into the world was not the tender, supported experience it should have been, but another trial in a life already filled with hardship. Mary Reynolds recalled how there was often no safe, quiet place for a mother to give birth, no warm room, no midwife with skilled hands, only the rough earth beneath her and the unrelenting sun above. In some cases, the labor began while the woman was still working in the fields, the overseers allowing little time for her to rest, forcing her to continue her tasks until the pain was too great to ignore. Harriet Jacobs, too, understood these moments of vulnerability, though she spoke of them through the stories she witnessed, knowing how quickly they could turn from a moment of hope into one of fear. Without access to proper medical care, childbirth itself became a gamble with a woman's life. The simplest complications could turn deadly, and the crude interventions available were often as dangerous as the conditions themselves. There were accounts of procedures intended to hasten delivery, sometimes involving the use of wooden chairs designed to force the body into certain positions, or in more severe cases, the application of methods so violent they could permanently injure the mother. Pelvic bones could be broken in an attempt to widen the birth canal, a measure that left lasting damage and unimaginable pain, often without even the dignity of privacy. These were not rare, isolated incidents. They were part of a wider reality in which the well-being of the mother mattered less than the economic value placed on the child she carried. Mary remembered the way women would try to shield each other during these moments, forming a circle to grant some measure of protection from prying eyes, whispering words of comfort even when their own voices shook. They used whatever scraps of cloth or warm water they could find, improvising care from almost nothing. Some women gave birth while kneeling in the dirt, others on makeshift wooden stools, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. Yet even in such conditions, there was a deep determination to survive, to hold the newborn close for as long as possible, to whisper promises into tiny ears, even when they knew those promises might be broken by forces beyond their control. Harriet spoke of the aftermath, of mothers returning to labor in the fields within days, their bodies still aching, their wounds unhealed. The lack of rest took its toll quickly. Some fell ill, some never recovered their strength. For the women themselves, these dangers were not abstract fears but constant companions, shadows that lingered with every pregnancy. And yet, despite knowing what awaited them, they faced these moments again and again, driven by love, by hope, and sometimes by the sheer will to leave something of themselves in the world, even if the world did not treat them kindly. The brutality of childbirth under such conditions was not only a physical ordeal but an emotional one. Every woman knew the unspoken truth that the moment she held her child might also be the beginning of a countdown to separation. This knowledge made the hours of labor feel heavier, every cry of pain mixed with the ache of uncertainty. For Mary, The memory of those moments never faded. She spoke of them not to shock, but to make sure the reality was understood that these were lives shaped by strength and endurance, but also by the constant denial of care and compassion that should be a basic human right. In remembering these stories, we see more than just the suffering. We see the unbreakable thread of resilience woven through each life. The women who endured such births were more than victims of a cruel system. They were survivors who carried the weight of both life and loss, whose strength allowed generations to follow. Their voices, passed down through memories and testimony, refused to let the truth be buried. And in telling these stories now, the harshness of those fields, the crude tools, the whispered prayers in the dark, all become part of a history that demands to be heard, so that the reality of what they endured is never silenced. In the dimly lit rooms of history, where ambition met cruelty, the story of Jade Marion Sims unfolds as a chilling chapter in the lives of enslaved women whose suffering became a laboratory for medical advancement. Often hailed as the father of modern gynecology, Sims' reputation in textbooks and museums speaks of innovation, surgical precision, and the pioneering of procedures that would later benefit countless women. But behind this veneer of progress lies a darker reality, a reality in which enslaved women were treated not as patients deserving care and compassion, but as vessels for experimentation, their bodies subjected to procedures without consent, without comfort, and without anesthesia. The very same women whose labor had been exploited on plantations were now forced to endure the blade and the probe, often in positions that heightened both their pain and their humiliation, while Sims and his assistants observed, recorded, and refined techniques that would later be sanitized in medical history as triumphs. Lucy and two young women whose names survive through the meticulous notes Sims kept, became unwilling participants in this medical theater. Lucy, only 18 and still recovering from childbirth, was brought to Sims because she suffered from a condition that left her unable to control her bladder, a complication common among women who endured repeated pregnancies under harsh labor conditions. Forced to bend forward onto her elbows with her head resting in her hands, she endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying as nearly a dozen onlookers watched, taking notes, and marveling at the process as though her pain was merely a necessary backdrop to discovery. Blood poisoning would later leave her weak for months, yet the records barely acknowledge her suffering, focusing instead on the success of the procedure. Anara, 17 and similarly burdened by traumatic childbirth, would endure 4 years of repeated experimentation before Sims perfected his technique, a refinement that would eventually be applied to white women under anesthesia, highlighting the cruel disparity in whose pain was recognized and whose was ignored. The experiments were not isolated incidents but emblematic of a systemic disregard for the lives and dignity of enslaved women. The belief that black women felt less pain than white women was not just a misconception, it was a justification, a social and scientific excuse that allowed Sims and his contemporaries to rationalize the agony inflicted. These women, already deprived of autonomy and subjected to relentless labor, now had their reproductive systems treated as tools, dissected in the name of progress. Their consent deemed unnecessary because the law recognized only the property rights of their owners. Every operation carried the implicit understanding that the owner's interest in preserving reproductive health for economic purposes outweighed the woman's right to safety, dignity, or comfort. Yet even within this brutal context, the resilience of these women is unmistakable, despite the excruciating pain and repeated invasions of their bodies. They endured, survived, and carried the weight of these experiences with a quiet strength that history can barely measure. Their stories, pieced together from interviews, letters, and narrative projects decades later, provide a lens through which we understand not only the medical advancements claimed by Sims, but the human cost hidden behind them. The pain, humiliation, and psychological trauma endured during these procedures were real, persistent, and profound. Yet for years the focus remained on the physician, on the progress, on the legacy of modern medicine, rather than the lives irreversibly altered by it. What makes these accounts even more harrowing is the intersection of medicine and ownership. These women did not have the agency to refuse. They could not simply walk away. Their participation was coerced, mediated through the authority of a system that had long treated them as less than human. The very fact that Sim's work relied exclusively on enslaved women highlights a deeper injustice. The benefits of knowledge were derived from the bodies of those least able to defend themselves, and the progress of science was built upon exploitation that was sanctioned by both law and custom. In this way, the story of Sims cannot be disentangled from the broader narrative of slavery itself, where reproductive labor, medical experimentation, and economic interest intersected in ways that left enduring scars. Through the eyes of Lucy, Anara, and countless others whose names were lost, we see a narrative of resilience under unimaginable pressure. Their endurance was not passive. It was a quiet assertion of humanity in a world that denied it. While Sim's techniques became a cornerstone of gynecology, the cost at which that knowledge came remains a moral and historical reckoning, reminding us that innovation untempered by ethics can perpetuate harm as much as it provides benefit. Their stories are an essential part of the history of medicine and of slavery, inseparable from the physical and emotional legacy that survived long after the surgical instruments were put away. Remembering the suffering of these women is not merely an act of historical curiosity. It is an acknowledgement of their humanity and a corrective to a history that too often celebrates the achievements of those in power while ignoring the lives of those who bore the burden. Lucy and, along with all the women who endured similar fates, stand as witnesses to both the cruelty and resilience of their era. Their experiences illuminate a truth that is uncomfortable but necessary: that progress without compassion leaves a trail of pain, and that the legacies of individuals like Sims can only be fully understood when we account for those whose voices were nearly silenced but whose courage echoes across generations. Lucy and Anna, two names preserved in the painstaking records of a medical history often celebrated for its innovation, represent more than just the milestones of gynecology. They are enduring symbols of unimaginable suffering and the human cost of scientific advancement built on exploitation. Lucy, only 18 when she was first subjected to repeated surgical procedures, had already experienced the physical and emotional toll of childbearing under a system that offered no reprieve or choice. Her body, accustomed to back-breaking labor in the fields, was now forced into positions of extreme vulnerability, bent forward onto elbows with her head resting on her hands, as surgeons tested, adjusted, and refined techniques that would later be hailed as breakthroughs. Each operation lasted hours. Each scream met not with comfort but with clinical observation, as doctors took meticulous notes and assessed the progress of their work, treating Lucy less as a person and more as a living instrument of study. In the months that followed, she endured the lingering effects of infections, exhaustion, and blood poisoning, a testament to the perilous conditions under which she had been made to endure her surgeries. Yet the medical records speak little of her pain, focusing instead on the success of the procedure itself. Anarcha, only 17, entered this grim chapter of her life after experiencing the trauma of childbirth in an environment that offered no care, no dignity, and no mercy. She became part of an ongoing series of experiments intended to perfect a surgical method for treating conditions like vesicovaginal fistula, a painful and socially isolating injury that was particularly common among enslaved women subjected to repeated pregnancies and the relentless strain of forced labor. Over the course of 4 years, Anna underwent dozens of operations, each conducted without anesthesia, her cries echoing in the sterile, in different rooms while doctors observed, adjusted, and debated techniques. The repeated intrusion into her body left both physical scars and emotional wounds. Yet she persisted, surviving what no young woman should ever have been asked to endure. Her resilience, like Lucy S., is a haunting reminder of the human spirit's capacity to withstand brutality, even when that brutality is cloaked in the language of progress and discovery. What makes these stories so compelling and so necessary to recount is the way they reveal the intersection of medicine, power, and dehumanization. Lucy and Anarcha were not just patients. They were enslaved women, their consent irrelevant, their suffering sanctioned by a system that valued the economic and scientific utility of their bodies above their dignity and well-being. Each procedure conducted by Dr. J. Marion Sims and his contemporaries was framed as a scientific necessity, yet it was inseparable from the larger context of enslavement, in which women were coerced into reproductive labor and denied agency over their own bodies. The medical experiments cannot be understood in isolation. They are a continuation of the same logic that had forced Mary Reynolds, Harriet Jacobs, and countless others into pregnancies against their will, removed their children, and treated their very existence as property. Even as the surgical techniques developed through these experiments later benefited other women, often white women receiving care under anesthesia, the contrast highlights a stark moral and racial divide. The young black women on whom these experiments were conducted endured pain that others never would have been asked to face. Their bodies used to advance a field of medicine that would celebrate innovation while remaining silent on the human cost of that progress. Lucy and Anarcha's experiences underscore the idea that progress without ethics carries a hidden toll, one measured not in medical charts or journal articles, but in the lifelong consequences borne by those who suffered in silence. Through their stories, we also glimpse moments of quiet defiance and resilience. Despite being placed in situations designed to strip them of agency, Lucy and Anarcha endured, survived, and in doing so left behind a legacy of courage that challenges the narratives of history, focused solely on the physicians and their accomplishments. Their endurance was a form of resistance, a refusal to allow the full erasure of their humanity, even in circumstances that rendered them nearly powerless. These young women, who might have been forgotten in the margins of history, now serve as crucial witnesses to the complex realities of slavery, medicine, and the exploitation of marginalized bodies. In recounting the ordeals of Lucy and Anarcha, the story of medical experimentation during the era of slavery becomes more than a tale of surgical innovation. It becomes a narrative of endurance, injustice, and the human cost of progress. Their suffering illuminates the intertwined systems of oppression, showing how race, gender, and social status intersected to create experiences of pain and resilience that were both extraordinary and harrowing. Remembering their stories compels us to confront the uncomfortable truths of history, to honor the resilience of those who endured, and to recognize that the foundations of modern medicine were not built solely on ingenuity, but also on the extraordinary endurance of those who had no choice but to survive. Lucy and Anna, through their suffering and survival, remind us that the story of history is never one-dimensional. It is woven from the triumphs and the tragedies, the celebrated and the silenced, and that acknowledging their experiences is essential to understanding the full scope of our past. Their lives, marked by unimaginable pain, are a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be erased, even in the face of cruelty sanctioned by society and recorded by history. Amid the relentless hardships endured by enslaved women, there existed a quieter form of resilience and wisdom, one rooted in the knowledge of their own bodies, the traditions of their communities, and the power of herbal remedies passed down through generations. Experienced women, often having endured multiple pregnancies and countless hours of back-breaking labor, became the unacknowledged pillars of survival, providing care and guidance to younger women whose lives were threatened by the brutal conditions of forced labor and pregnancy. These women practiced midwifery and herbal medicine not because they were formally trained or recognized by the prevailing systems of power, but because they understood that life itself depended on their skill, their vigilance, and their commitment to one another. In small, dimly lit quarters, or under the shade of a tree at the edge of the fields, they administered herbal poultices, brewed teas to ease pain, and instructed mothers on positions and techniques that could improve the chances of a safe birth, often improvising with the scarce resources available to them in an environment designed to deny care. Mary Reynolds' recollections are filled with the quiet heroism of these women. She spoke of older women whose hands were worn and scarred from years of labor, yet whose touch was gentle and assured, who would guide a young mother through the terrifying hours of labor. Whispering encouragement, warning of dangers, and offering remedies that had been proven through experience rather than formal study. Harriet Jacobs, observing and surviving the same world of exploitation, also recognized the vital importance of these midwives, whose knowledge sometimes bridged the gap between life and death, whose presence could mean the difference between a newborn thriving and a child lost to infection or neglect. These women, though unpaid and undervalued by the very system that profited from the lives of their charges, carried an extraordinary authority within their communities, a knowledge born of necessity, resilience, and an intimate understanding of human anatomy gained through survival rather than institutional study. Their work was deeply intertwined with the everyday realities of slavery, when white physicians conducted surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia, exploiting their bodies for scientific advancement. It was often these midwives who attempted to mitigate the suffering afterward, tending to wounds, preparing healing balms, and offering what comfort they could with whispered prayers and hands steady with experience. They recognized the dangers of birthing in crude conditions on dirt floors, makeshift birthing chairs, or under the watchful eyes of overseers, and did what they could to create spaces that, however small, allowed women some dignity and some measure of control over their own bodies. Every poultice, every carefully applied pressure, every herbal infusion was an act of quiet defiance against a system that refused to see them as human, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of those who were forced to care for others while being denied care themselves. The value of this knowledge extended beyond the moment of birth. Experienced midwives were also custodians of communal wisdom, passing down instructions about nutrition, hygiene, and postpartum care, teaching women to recognize early signs of complications and to prepare for the next pregnancy that would inevitably come. Their expertise allowed entire generations of children to survive despite the lack of formal medical care and the harshness of the plantation environment. Yet this expertise remained largely invisible in the historical record, overshadowed by the celebrated achievements of male physicians whose innovations were built upon the suffering and labor of enslaved women. These midwives also offered emotional support, a factor often overlooked but essential in a world where mothers knew that their children could be taken from them at any moment. In whispered songs, gentle rocking, and soft reassurances, they created a network of care that nurtured both body and spirit. Mary Reynolds remembered the way these women would tell stories of survival, reminding the younger generation that they were not alone, that strength could be found even when the world sought to strip it away. Harriet Jacobs' writings echo this sentiment, portraying the profound interdependence among enslaved women. Where knowledge, courage, and empathy were shared as a lifeline in a society that denied them agency. The practice of midwifery and herbal medicine among enslaved women demonstrates a remarkable blend of science, intuition, and cultural tradition. These women were practitioners, healers, and educators, navigating a system designed to exploit them while sustaining life under impossible circumstances. Their contribution was essential not only for the survival of individual mothers and children, but for the continuity of the community itself, preserving knowledge and nurturing resilience in the face of relentless adversity. Even today, the legacy of these midwives offers lessons about the value of experience, the importance of community-based care, and the power of women supporting one another in environments that seek to diminish their autonomy. Their courage and ingenuity stand as a counterpoint to the cruelty that surrounded them, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings find ways to protect, nurture, and sustain life. The story of these women, often hidden in the margins of history, is a story of survival, of resistance, and of the extraordinary strength of those who were forced to labor, endure, and heal without recognition, yet whose impact resonates across generations and continues to inspire. The birth of a child in the lives of enslaved women was a moment fraught with peril, not only for the mother enduring the grueling labor and cruel conditions, but also for the child whose future was dictated not by love or family, but by the demands of a system that treated human beings as commodities. From the moment of birth, children of enslaved women were considered property, their very existence tied to the economic interests of those who claimed ownership over their mothers. Mary Reynolds recalled the heartbreak of mothers cradling newborns for mere weeks, only to have them taken away, sold to other plantations, or placed in nurseries where conditions were harsh and care was minimal at best. The laws themselves reinforced this cruelty, codifying the hereditary nature of slavery in statutes like the 1662 Virginia law, which declared that children born to enslaved women would automatically inherit the status of their mothers. This legal framework ensured that slavery would perpetuate itself, binding generation after generation to a life stripped of autonomy, dignity, and opportunity. The separation of children from their mothers was a daily, painful reality. Mothers would weep in the fields, their cries unheard or ignored by overseers, as infants were led away, often never to be seen again. Some children were sold for profit shortly after weaning, their identities reduced to monetary value, their futures determined by the market rather than parental care. Harriet Jacobs' narrative offers insight into the emotional toll of this system, describing the constant anxiety and grief that mothers carried, knowing that attachment itself was a risk, a temporary pleasure that could be ripped away at the whim of an owner. Each act of separation was compounded by the lack of education and rights afforded to these children. They were denied the most basic tools for survival beyond the plantation, their early years shaped entirely by labor, deprivation, and the brutal logic of a system that valued productivity over humanity. Even within this dehumanizing framework, enslaved women and their communities sought ways to protect and nurture their children. Grandmothers, aunts, and older siblings often stepped into caregiving roles, offering what comfort and guidance they could in the absence of parental control. Through whispered stories, quiet lessons in survival, and the preservation of cultural traditions, these women attempted to instill a sense of identity and resilience in the youngest members of their community, even while the law and the market threatened to erase those very connections. The effort was never enough to counteract the full force of systemic oppression, but it represents a remarkable testament to human ingenuity and endurance, as mothers and caretakers fought to safeguard dignity and nurture in a world that denied both. The economic motives behind the sale of children were stark. Young boys and girls were assessed for physical strength, aptitude, and perceived health, often marketed as valuable property for their potential to generate future wealth through labor or reproduction. On some plantations, advertisements in newspapers listed children as if they were livestock, emphasizing their physical traits, potential output, and suitability for breeding or field work. The chilling reality was that the separation of families was not incidental but deliberate, a calculated strategy to maximize profit and maintain control over enslaved populations. Even the smallest infants were not spared. Their existence was subordinated entirely to the economic objectives of their owners. For the children themselves, growing up under these conditions meant navigating a world where attachment, identity, and security were constantly under threat. Their formative experiences were shaped by labor, surveillance, and the constant presence of danger, leaving few opportunities for play, learning, or personal development. Education, literacy, and knowledge of the wider world were often denied outright, reinforcing the cycle of dependence and limiting any potential for self-determination. Laws like the 1662 Virginia Statute codified this system, embedding inequality into the very fabric of society and ensuring that the legal apparatus would support the continuation of slavery across generations. Every child born to an enslaved mother became a participant in this system. Their rights subordinated to the property interests of others, their futures preordained by a combination of biology and law rather than choice or opportunity. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, enslaved families found ways to resist, preserve their humanity, and maintain connections where they could. Stories of secret gatherings, coded communication, and the careful transmission of family knowledge reflect a persistent effort to safeguard identity and community, even when the official structures of society sought to strip them away. The resilience of these children, nurtured by mothers and extended family members against impossible odds, became a living testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of systematic oppression. The law, economic incentive, and social structures of the time created a world in which children were born into bondage, their lives shaped by systems beyond their control. The hereditary nature of slavery, reinforced by statutes like the Virginia law, ensured that the suffering of one generation would extend into the next, creating a continuity of exploitation that could last decades. Yet even within this grim reality, the efforts of mothers, midwives, and communities to care for, educate, and protect children, however limited those efforts might have been, illustrate the profound strength, courage, and determination that defined the human experience under slavery. Understanding the experiences of these children deepens our comprehension of the broader system of enslavement, reminding us that the horrors of slavery extended far beyond physical labor or the experiences of mothers. The inherited chains of law and custom shaped entire lifetimes, dictating access to care, education, and freedom. By listening to the stories of mothers, children, and community members who survived these conditions, we confront a history of resilience, loss, and courage that challenges us to reflect on the human cost of systemic injustice and the enduring power of familial and communal bonds, even in the most oppressive circumstances. As we reach the end of this journey through one of the most harrowing chapters of American history, it becomes clear that the legacy of slave breeding is more than just a historical fact. It is a stark reminder of how power, greed, and dehumanization can intertwine to strip individuals of their dignity, autonomy, and very identity. The stories we have explored, from the brutal conditions faced by pregnant enslaved women forced to labor under the unforgiving sun, to the cruel separation of children from their mothers, to the unconsented medical experiments performed on women like Lucy and Anarcha, paint a picture of a system that valued profit over human life, treating people as mere property to be exploited and discarded. Understanding this past is not simply an academic exercise. It is a moral imperative, a call to recognize the resilience and courage of those who endured such unimaginable suffering, and to ensure that the lessons of history are not forgotten or repeated. Education plays a critical role in this process. By learning about the realities of slavery, particularly the lesser-known but deeply impactful practices like slave breeding, we begin to appreciate the magnitude of human suffering that was inflicted systematically for the benefit of a few. It is through knowledge that empathy is cultivated, and it is through empathy that societies can develop safeguards against the repetition of injustice. recognizing the humanity of those who were oppressed, honoring their stories, and sharing these narratives with others creates a collective memory that resists erasure and actively counters ignorance. This is why telling these stories matters, not just to understand the past, but to shape a more just, compassionate, and equitable future. The legacy of slave breeding also reminds us that the human spirit, even under extreme duress, is capable of remarkable resilience. Mothers who nurtured children they might never see again, midwives and healers who preserved vital knowledge in secret, and young women like Lucy and Anaka who endured surgical experimentation without anesthesia, all represent extraordinary acts of courage. Their endurance, their resourcefulness, and their determination to survive under circumstances designed to destroy them serve as lessons in both human strength and the ethical responsibility of those in positions of power. It is a reminder that progress, whether social, scientific, or economic, must never come at the expense of basic human dignity, and that systems which devalue human life are not only morally indefensible but ultimately corrosive to society itself. In reflecting on this history, it is essential to connect the past with our present. Issues of reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, systemic oppression, and the fight for equality remain deeply relevant today. Understanding the exploitation and abuse faced by enslaved women highlights why ongoing vigilance, advocacy, and education are crucial to prevent history from repeating itself. We owe it to the memory of those who suffered to ensure that the injustices of slavery, and specifically the horrors of slave breeding, are neither forgotten nor minimized. By confronting these painful truths head-on, we develop the awareness, empathy, and resolve needed to create a society where human rights are respected and protected for all, regardless of race, gender, or social status. We also learn from the resilience of enslaved communities, whose efforts to preserve knowledge, nurture their children, and support one another offer timeless lessons on solidarity and mutual care. The stories of midwives and herbal practitioners remind us that expertise and wisdom often flourish in the most adverse conditions, and that the strength of communities can be a powerful force for survival and resistance, even when formal recognition is denied. Recognizing these contributions allows us to honor the courage and ingenuity of those whose work sustained generations, ensuring that their impact is remembered alongside the tragedies they endured. As we close this chapter together, it is my hope that these stories inspire reflection, empathy, and a commitment to justice. The horrors of slave breeding are a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also a testament to the enduring spirit of those who resisted, survived, and preserved the threads of humanity against overwhelming odds. By remembering their experiences, sharing their stories, and educating ourselves and others, we actively participate in honoring their lives and preventing similar injustices from ever taking root again. Thank you so much for staying with me through this exploration of history's painful but crucial lessons. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others so that these stories continue to be told and remembered. Your support helps keep the memory and resilience of these extraordinary individuals alive, ensuring that their struggles were not in vain. Together, through learning, reflection, and empathy, we can honor the past while striving to build a more just future. Now, as the day comes to a close, I wish each of you a peaceful night filled with rest and reflection, and may your dreams carry forward the lessons of resilience, courage, and humanity that we have shared today. Good night, and sleep well.